You can start now? Fine. Great. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in London and especially here at the Nehru Center because Jawaharlal Nehru is someone whom I've heard so much of. I saw him as a child, but I really didn't know him. Of course, I was really a child. But my grandparents and the entire family and all friends, I mean, he was such a charismatic figure, he was, and he's like a mythical character for me. So it's a real pleasure to be here at the Nehru Center. Good evening, and first of all, I want to thank the Nehru Center for arranging this talk today and for all of you to have made the time to come here. I know how difficult it is in a city like London to set aside the time and actually get to a place. So it's truly an honor for me to celebrate the two women, Rukmini Devi Arundale, 1904, 1986, and MS Subbulakshmi, 1916, 2004. The two iconic women who made what can only be described as transformational contributions to the Renaissance, to the revival, and the revitalization of modern India's cultural landscape. This venue is really special, as I said before, because we know how Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru acknowledged their contributions many times as only he could. After all, Nehruji himself had the soul of an artist. In their turn, these two women were admirers and friends of the first Prime Minister of India. Today, I speak from my experience as a journalist who has written extensively about their work and their performance and their achievements on the social fabric. Also, I had interacted closely with both as an alumnus of Kalakshetra when it was under Rukmini Devi's guidance and as MS Subbulakshmi's vocal accompanist for about 16 years. You will ask, why bring these two artists together, apart from the fact that I knew them personally? Why bring these two artists together, dancer and musician, when they functioned in different fields and never collaborated in anything? True, the two women provide a study in contrast in the way they were raised and trained in their arts, in the genres they practiced. And we can also see that they were polar opposites in personality, character, temperament. One was self-assured and imperious. The other was exceptionally timid and humble. But they had this in common. They were motivated by the same goal, the same vision, and the same ideologies. They were patriotic to the core, perfectly natural in times when India was emerging from the shackles of slavery into the light of freedom, and later striving to develop its identity as an independent nation. But their patriotism was never narrow or jingoistic. It was energized by their conviction that all human beings were equals and the world should enjoy peace and prosperity. Their artistic mission was also an endeavor to forge kinship, the kind of kinship that binds humanity together beyond all divisions of caste, creed, and class. The well-known phrase Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is used by the government all the time, it was not a catchphrase for them. It was a living reality. They were both convinced that art was not entertainment. It was a means, and mind you, they really wanted to reach out to the largest number of people with their art. They wanted to have an impact, but they knew that it was not entertainment. It was the means to foster communal harmony and spiritual awakening for both the individual, the performer, and the community, the spectators. Let us go to their early years to see the hows and whys of this process of their external and internal growth. Next. Rukmini Devi was lucky. And I don't mean that she was lucky in being born into the entitled class. We know all about the positive side of privilege and entitlement. But remember, as a woman, she definitely belonged to the marginalized class of beings in the orthodox and hidebound society of old Madras, India, in the early 20th century. Women's emancipation was an idea. It had to get traction. But Rukmini Devi was born to Nilakantha Shastri and to Seshammal, who had broken the shackles of regressive patriarchy by joining the Theosophical Society. Next. Now, Theosophy had its occult and mystic side, but what stood out in Theosophy was that it promoted intellectual explorations, social reform, and political aspirations. Its main credo, Satyam Nasti Paro Dharmaha. You will find it written there in the society if you ever go there, beautifully carved on the wall. There is no religion higher than the truth. A natural corollary of this idea was that all religions were multiple pathways to the same transcendent reality, which was, of course, the supreme truth. Next, reportedly, the idea of the National Congress was born around 1881 at a meeting in the Theosophical Society's headquarters in Adyar, in Old Madras. But soon after this, we do know that the British civil servant Alan Octavian Hume, a theosophist, brought the Indian leaders of those times together, and he brought them together in Bombay to found the Indian National Congress in 1885. That is how Theosophy became an integral part of the Indian struggle for independence. Dr. Annie Besant, president of the Theosophical Society, became the president of the Indian National Congress in 1917, the first woman and the only woman of Western origin to do so. A mesmerizing orator and charismatic leader. I've heard so many people talk about her mesmerizing oratory. But Besant was able to inspire men and women with progressive goals for India and with very high-minded ideals. Under her, the inward mystical thrust of the Theosophical Society acquired an outward communitarian outreach. Little Rukmini grew up under Besant's magnificent presence, magnetic presence. Located in the extensive woods beside the Adyar River's estuary, the Theosophical Society's lush, sprawling campus became her school and her home ground. Her young mind and ardent spirit were nurtured by coming into contact with educationists, social reformers, thinkers, statesmen, scientists, as well as mystics, writers, and artists. They were all theosophists and they congregated there. They came from many parts of the world and they were eminent in their own field and revolutionary in their approach. We have to go back to those times. Those ideas were absolutely new at that time. They were not motivated by thoughts of worldly advancement. And that is how the young Tamil girl of limited experience found her mind deepening and her horizons expanding all the time. What a privileged upbringing. The most important among them, among the Theosophists, after Dr. Besant, was Dr. George Sidney Arundel, 1878-1945, an aristocratic Englishman and Dr. Besant's staunch lieutenant, who became the Theosophical Society's president after Besant. He not only organized the National University of India in Madras with Rabindranath Tagore as its first chancellor, but also got arrested for his involvement in the Indian independence movement. All these intellectual, political, and spiritual, mystical pursuits could not keep love at bay. Our Dr. Arundel launched a scandal by falling in love with Rukmini and marrying her, though there were 26 years between them. How could 16 even like 42? I asked Rukmini Devi's elder sister, Dr. Shivakamu, and she said, "Oh, we thought it was Rukmini who was lucky to have his love," she answered. But not all her siblings, not everyone agreed, and not all her siblings agreed, because one of her brothers, Yageshwara Shastri, actually went on a protest march along the marina, protesting against his sister's marriage to a white man. So, yes, the marriage sparked virulent public protests. A Hindu girl marrying a white Christian was unthinkable in those times. But Rukmini Devi would say very indignantly, why? Dr. Arundel was more Hindu than all those silly, stupid protesters. She'd be quite angry about it. In fact, it was he who made me aware of the philosophical and the spiritual heritage of India, she always said. It was true. Her life with Arundel constantly made Rukmini aware of the spiritual dimension in every human thought, action, and intention. Marriage brought a radical change in Rukmini's life. She began to emerge as a public figure, heading the World Federation of Young Theosophists, making eloquent speeches on the stage with other much older, much more experienced luminaries of those times. An associate recalled, why not? She had joined in an intimate association with two charismatic figures as daughter, pupil, and helper to Besant, as life's companion and assistant to Dr. Arundel. However, Rukmini was to recognize her own mission in life rather serendipitously. I don't know if I should mention the fact that her work in the Theosophical Society, the Theosophists at that time believed that a new world was being ushered in, and she underwent some initiations and was proclaimed World Mother, just as Jiddu Krishnamurti was going to be proclaimed as a messianic figure later. But at no time then or later did Rukmini Devi ever claim to have any mystic associations or any mystic capacities. So I was just saying that Rukmini Devi recognized her mission in life serendipitously in 1928, when the Arundels voyaged down under for the husband to take charge as secretary of the Theosophical Society in Australia. They found Anna Pavlova, the world-famous ballet dancer, as a co-passenger. Horror-struck and spellbound, Rukmini followed her, as she herself said, like the proverbial lamb following Mary. Clearly, Pavlova saw something in Rukmini, for she said, "Come to London and I'll teach you ballet. But you can start right here with my own teacher, Cleo Noddy." That is how Rukmini Devi began her ballet lessons. And later, Pavlova added, "I think you should learn the dancing of your own country." And Rukmini Devi always said, "Pavlova was my spiritual teacher who launched me along my way." By the way, the lessons never did take place because Pavlova passed away. I have spent some time going over these preludes to Rukmini Devi's career as a Renaissance figure in Bharatanatyam, only because I wanted to emphasize the fact that she had a very atypical background and very unusual circumstances in the way she grew up. These were the atypical circumstances under which she came to know and take up the art of Sadir, as the dance was then known in Tamil Nadu. Much has been said about how Rukmini Devi sanitized and sterilized Sadir, the dance of the Devadasis, and turned it into Bharatanatyam, a Sanskrit term which at once transposes it to a realm where the practitioners and the spectators belong to a completely different class from the Sadir world. Now, this discourse also posits the idea that she snatched Sadir from the traditional practitioners, the Devadasi courtesans, to be appropriated exclusively for upper class Brahmin community. And somehow she has become the singular culprit, solely responsible for bringing about this obviously drastic and unwelcome change. So much sense and nonsense has been spewed about this, for and against this charge, that we suspect that the truth lies somewhere in between. But here I'd also like to note the fact that M.S. Subbulakshmi, about whom we are going to talk a little later, was a musician from the courtesan community. She has also been recognized as someone who Brahminized her music. I think, but she has not been vilified for it as Rukmini Devi has been. I think that looking at Rukmini Devi's background and the nurturing processes of the way she was raised, we can understand clearly her aims and motives in taking up this art form, and quite late in life. And that too, an art form about which she practically nothing, because until then, Sadir was the exclusive preserve of the courtesan dancers, and women from the so-called middle class and upper class were barred from hearing or watching the Devadasis and totally banned from learning those arts, because it was believed that singing and dancing made women lose their virtue. Nor did Adyar society know anything about Indian dancing at that time. It was only in 1935 that Rukmini Devi herself saw two Devadasis who happened to be dancing at the Madras Music Academy, Jeevaratnam and Rajalakshmi. And she also saw T. Balasaraswati perform in a friend's house. She was completely struck by Bala's grace. This triggered her search to find a dance guru from whom she could learn. And she found Gauri Ammal, the Devadasi at the Mylapore temple. And Rukmini Devi said, quote, "I was moved by Gauri Ammal's dignity, grace, and the element of surprise that I saw in the way she danced. Perhaps you can find this only in someone who has inherited by birth what others are unable to have." So she recognized that there is something about the dance which comes down through, which comes to you as a heritage, as a legacy. She began to learn from Gauri Amma, but craved for something more until she found what she really sought in Guru Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, the famous Nattuvanar of those times. He too had to overcome a great deal of hesitations and apprehensions. Actually, it was a problem for him to teach a 30-year-old woman, married to a white man to boot. Firstly, there was strong opposition from his own family, and secondly, he was also filled with all kinds of suspicions. Anyway, he took up and started teaching her. At that time, all that Rukmini aimed for was to do something that would give pleasure to her friends and to the community of the Theosophists. The young Theosophists had already picked up all kinds of dances, Greek dances, Romanian dances, Egyptian dances, or what they thought were Romanian, Egypt dances. And of course, there was Rukmini Devi herself attempting to do a little bit of ballet. But all this was done among friends for fun and as a happy pastime, rather than for show or, for presenting it before the public. But what the young theosophists did at that time, and which fascinates me, is the fact that they put up many, many plays. This is Rukmini Devi as Yashodhara in their play Buddha, based on Edwin Arnold's famous Light of Asia. And then they did a play about Giordano Bruno, the Italian philosopher, and about Bhishma, Karekala Mayar, and so on. And these were all subjects which pushed the frontiers of knowledge and fostered universal values that everyone could accept. My mother once described as a young girl, seeing Rukmini Devi perform Bhishma. And I believe she played the role of Ganga, and she emerged from behind translucent curtains of billowing net, her dark hair, my mother said, her dark hair flowing like a cloud behind her. We know that Rukmini Devi introduced a wholly new Indian aesthetics in all these initial theatre ventures. But it came also from her exposure to Western theatre, to ballet in particular, and her familiarity with Southeast Asia's many, many theatre forms. She had seen them all personally in her travels. And all this wealth was part of her when she started learning Indian dance. I think that is something that we should absolutely bear in mind, that she did not come to Indian dance as a novice who knew nothing about anything, but she had a great I don't know about great, but a wide exposure and understanding of other dance styles from other parts of the world, and theater and poetry and music. So, next, Rukmini Devi had tremendous admiration for Meenakshi Sundaram Pillai, his in-depth knowledge of the subject. He, on his part, realized that she was no dilettante, but an earnest, intelligent student. And when he perceived her bent of mind, she was his first student who was not a Devadasi. So for him, it was a trial and, error method. So when he saw that she had a certain bent of mind, being a theosophist, he too began to innovate by composing, especially for her, songs with a devotional content, the kritis of Carnatic music. This had not been done before. And there were so many objections from his own family, and this made him stop. But he continued to encourage Rukmini Devi to perform the traditional Sringara Padams, which were part of the repertoire that he taught her. And he taught them and told her to perform them in her own way, as she experienced the content. He wanted her to own this in the way she danced. And he didn't want her to mimic what he taught. And he also knew, Rukmini Devi said, that dance was something that was shaped by the dancer's personality. It was not something that you could just take and absorb from an external source. You have to internalize it, and it has to come through the prisms of your own experience, your own emotions. So the way she performed was her own. We can see that to Rukmini Devi, the process of learning to dance became a process of developing her own philosophy of why art was indispensable to life. And I quote, "Human beings absorb by intuition as much as they do by conscious learning. They learn from the environment, nature, life, thought, philosophy, and from the creative impulse within. They charge one's inspiration, and then art becomes expression." End quote. Meanwhile, her taking up dancing stirred up raucous controversy, just as her marriage had done earlier. And in 1935, threats of boycott and protests loomed over her Arangetram, which, by the way, was nothing but sharing what she had learned with Theosophist friends at the Diamond Jubilee Convention of the Theosophical Society. But outsiders came out of curiosity to condemn, and I believe they applauded. Now, Dr. Arundale saw new possibilities in what Rukmini Devi was doing. And he thought that the Theosophical Society should sponsor a new movement for discovering spiritual reality through the arts. This is something the Theosophical Society had not done. They had gone into mystical experiences and into actual study, intellectual pursuits. So, but Rukmini Devi saw it as a quest for beauty to discover truth. Well, I don't know what it is. Anyway, it's not mine. So, Kalakshetra was launched in 1936 as an International Academy of the Arts. What is this? It's not from mine. Sounds like the ice cream man. Okay. I'm glad we identified the source. Some diversion. Anyway. So, Kalakshetra was launched in 1936 as an International Academy of the Arts, not to resuscitate or regenerate the art form, or to purify it of some dross, or to improve the art by forcibly appropriating this art form for some kind of sybaritic elite. As Rukmini Devi herself said time and time again, there was nothing to purify in the dance of the Devadasis. They were wonderful. So what was her purpose in continuing to dance and to start an institution? To Rukmini Devi, this pursuit was the recognition of our country's priceless artistic traditions, neglected under the British regime. She believed that by practicing dance, music, and poetry, the soul would be, that dance, poetry, and music would foster A, the country's individual, national, spiritual growth, B, educate us in values, C, sensitize society to develop compassion, justice, fraternity, and equality, trigger our concern for nature and the living beings with whom we share this planet, and of course, spiritual growth was to be an inevitable part of this endeavor, but that was last. Let us remember that the people of that era had a very holistic, comprehensive, and inclusive vision. To Gandhi, after all, in political protest, satyagraha was really an assertion of moral values and truth, and spiritual purification. To Vivekananda, social service was religious worship. Tagore was convinced that art educated you in naturalism, living with nature, and in humanism. So Kalakshetra evolved three goals: education without fear, art without vulgarity. No, this has nothing to do with sensuousness. This vulgarity is commercialism, pomp, ostentation, display of ego, and beauty without cruelty. That is how Rukmini Devi began to contribute to the renaissance of Indian culture. First, under a tree with a single guru and a single student, herself. Then two girls from the Theosophical Society's campus joined the classes, and the classes multiplied and developed and got scattered across the campus. Between the trees, where the birds called and squirrels scampered and the sea droned on beyond the lush campus. The institution's aim was not to produce stage artists, I repeat. The idea was not to turn out artists to perform on the stage, assembly line artists, not at all. She herself has said it many times, and so have her primary disciples. The aim of the institution was to train body and mind to acquire a yogic focus in movement, thought, and feeling. Why? To reflect that inner beauty of character and soul. There was a time when I didn't want to dance at all and I wanted to quit. And Rukmini Devi told me, why did I not want to dance? I wanted to read all the time. I love books and poetry and stuff like that. So she called me and she said, learn to dance. You will understand literature and certainly poetry much better. You'll get much more out of it. She didn't convince me, but that was her perspective. Rukmini Devi said, we cannot all become artists. And I'm quoting, we cannot all become artists, but every one of us can be a good human being by learning to enjoy the arts. That's my goal, to develop the character of every student who comes here, to be kind, alert, sensitive. That in itself is serving the country and all the world. Looking back, it seems astonishing that she should have gathered such a galaxy of artists from every field to come and work with her from across the world, not only from India and not only from Tamil Nadu. They inspired each other and they inspired the students. Other quiet revolutions were carried out in the Kalakshetra campus. The crafts were deemed to be as important as the arts. No distinctions of caste, class, gender, or creed was admitted or accepted. Every day began with and continues to begin with the prayers of every religion, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, and Dr. Besant's prayer to the universal spirit, which is absolutely beautiful. Traditionally, Bharatanatyam was a woman's preserve. Kalakshetra changed this trend by admitting boys. This was a kind of a revolution in itself. And the Adyar women achieved their gender equality by learning dance and by serving. The cycle became their practical symbol of freedom. Soon the suburb became the only one in the city where women in traditional saris and dance costumes went cycling everywhere. And I know because my mother, a lifelong student and a teacher of Kalakshetra, used to take me pillion riding, and mother and daughter were students at the same institution. So, this was at a time when Adyar was seen to be, the suburb where Kalakshetra existed at that time, it was seen to be Land's End, back of the beyond from old Madras. Nobody ever came there. There's a bridge across the river Adyar. Nobody ever crossed it. By degrees, Rukmini Devi added a book publishing center, a handloom section to revive the designs and techniques and colors and dyes of the old weaving styles, a Montessori school where the world-renowned Maria Montessori came to set up, and she stayed there for 4 years. And a teacher's training center, an artist's atelier, and even a small photographic unit under a Western photographer called Conrad Worldring. He made Adyar his home. Rukmini Devi's global connections as a theosophist made this little art center develop a global network. Donors from across the world gave money, and specialists came to donate their time and their skills. Alex Elmore, Paul Storm, these were experts in lighting and theater. They came and stayed there to train the students and work during Kalakshetra art festivals. And there was Serge Brizzy, who came, I think, from the Netherlands, who worked in a clerical post in order to assist what she thought was a mission. And the students came from everywhere. There was a flamenco dancer from Spain, a ballet dancer from Argentina, and so on. And the impromptu evening soirees, oh my God, they were so amazing, Budalur Krishnamurti Shastri had an old Brahmin with a tuft would arrive with his Gotu Vadyam and play the rigorous way. Pandit Ravi Shankar would be a visiting artist there. He would bring a sitar and sit down. And some German musician who was around would play on Dr. Arundale's piano, which was in the music room then. And we think fusion is modern. So we children, we beamed back at so many visitors, kings and queens of England and Europe, world leaders, scientists, economists, politicians, industrialists, actors from West End and Broadway. We worked for animal welfare projects in which Rukmini Devi was interested, and also the Vegetarian Congress. So we had something to do every day other than go to class. We'd all agree, finally, that Rukmini Devi's most outstanding achievement was the creation of the unique genre of the dance drama. It epitomized all her convictions. It helped her involve young students in the kind of teamwork that would motivate them to reach for higher goals and inspire the public with their goals. They would learn the best about human nature, she thought, and they would also learn about the pitfalls that are waiting to trip you up. And they would do this not as moral science lessons, but by reliving those experiences by enacting them. You never forgot. Rukmini Devi perfected the genre of the 6-part Ramayana series, 1954 to 1970, while her knowledge of ballet and Western theater, that's obvious when you see those productions, but there's nothing other than Indian in the experience that you have when you see them. She went for the symbolic and not for the subtle. She never liked anything overt and literal. She always wanted to find something that was nuanced. The use of space, characterization, entries, exits, gestures, stances, postures, every single detail glowed in its place, and everything from costume and lighting to movement and expression gave multi-dimensional scope for imagination and originality. For Rukmini Devi's choreography had this aim. She wanted to inspire the spectators to see everything in their own mind's eye, not see what was there, but to see something within. For her too, this was a new discovery, and I quote, "It is a miracle to see how the human body, energized by imagination and feeling, can create the illusion that we can be anything and anyone we wish to be. That is how art is the best training ground to learn about human strengths and weaknesses, about all that is possible for human beings to achieve, why we are all connected in brotherhood. That is why art can foster our most noble aspirations and free us to pursue them. It is the highest form of self-realization, something that we don't have to ransack the clouds to find. It is here, right here, within each one of us, waiting to be experienced." Rukmini Devi had always loved nature and all its creatures, so much so that if a snake entered the classroom, she would say, "Don't frighten the snake. Go out quietly, let it leave by itself, then you can come back to class." This happened so frequently, I can't tell you. We know that she served 2 terms in the Rajya Sabha, piloted the bill to enact Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, but later invited to accept the nomination of the post of the President of India, she refused. She would not neglect her work in Kalakshetra, which was her life's mission. I honestly believe that Rukmini Devi's contribution was her vision. She had unshakable faith in beauty, beauty that nurtured Satya, Dharma, and Jiva Karunya, compassion for all living forms. Experience that beauty in rasa, she would say, or feel it as the joy in the arts. This brings bliss to each one of us here, now, and always. Now we look at the other luminary, M.S. Subbulakshmi, 1916-2004. Her background and upbringing were polar opposites to Rukmini Devi's. She was not born in a privileged class, liberal milieu with financial security or free from privation. Nor did she have parents with liberal and progressive views. Her background was hidebound and conventional, unbothered by the rising currents of the freedom thirst, social change, anti-British revolt. They knew nothing of this. To understand Subbulakshmi, we have to trace two entirely different but equally unremitting influences on her psyche. Her birth, the first is her birth in the traditional courtesan clan named Devadasi, as you know, with its specific social background. The Devadasis were custodians of culture and owned an artistic legacy which highlighted Shringaram, or romantic love. Dedicated to the temple deity, they sang and danced during the temple rituals, at royal courts, and at the family functions of the wealthy aristocrats. This is how the Devadasis lived. B, the mainstream legacy of South Indian Carnatic music, which is the bhakti tradition, the path of devotion. It was sustained by compositions by eulogizing surrender to the divine, often focusing on a personal god. Now take the first, the Devadasi tradition. Subbulakshmi's birth to Veena artist Shanmukhavadivu in the Devadasi community, where the women were called Nitya Sumangalis, auspicious women, married to the gods. They could not marry humans, but had to be supported by wealthy upper caste patrons. Kunjama grew up in the colonial regime, when Devadasis were disparaged as women of ill repute, and their priceless art heritage was denounced as lascivious and immoral. In 1880, this is before her birth, Justice West of Bombay called the temple dancer tradition evil and vicious and denied Devadasis protection under all civil law. In South India, the pioneering reformist Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy launched a furious anti-Noch campaign demanding the wholesale demolition of the Devadasi system. Crippling legislation was passed against the Devadasis from 1927, followed by total abolition in 1934. Independent India has continued to legislate against the Devadasis in the different states at different times, and actually it continues even now. Under British colonial rule, patronage from Indian royalty and upper caste landowners dwindled, as we saw. The Devadasi courtesans lost their standing. They were now stigmatized as Noch girls or dancing whores. Temple stipends ceased, and only concubinage to patrons offered any subsistence to them. No one would marry a Devadasi. The stigma was too great. In the 1920s and 30s, women from the so-called respectable families did not sing and dance in public, as we saw, or even attend public concerts. Anyone who did incurred serious censure. Born in a little narrow lane close to the Madurai temple, Kunjama, or little one, that's how she was called. Kunjama stood on the threshold to hear the Nadaswaram pipes and tabal drums in the procession of the temple deity, and that circled the streets. And this was the highest music that she could ever hear. And her own home echoed with music, where Mother Shanmukhavadivu, a fine veena player and a very old school martinet, practiced and taught disciples, including her own 3 children. Illustrious musicians came to visit this humble home. They sang songs and exchanged musical compositions with Shanmukhavadivu. Shanmukhavadivu had a patron in a lawyer, Subramanya Iyer, who lived just a few streets away. And he lived there with his legitimate family. Kunjama loved her father, who now and then visited their home, their dingy home, called her Princess Darling. And his devotion to Rama was very deep. And the child MS cherished memories of the Ramanavami puja that he conducted when she was allowed to sit next to him and sing songs and bhajans with her father. We can see that Subramanya Iyer was a typical well-to-do man of the entitled class, comfortable with British overlordship, untroubled by the rumblings of the freedom revolt, leading a very conventional life with a Brahmin wife and a Devadasi mistress, which was a status symbol in those days, gaining a reputation by conducting music concerts with visiting musicians. Now, we also know that finding social acceptance became an obsession for little Kunjama from the time she noted the difference between her father's family and her own family. And all her life, she too wanted to be accepted as a Brahmin, to gain respectability. Now, how can you blame her when she lived in a society which made her feel inferior by birth and had to be accepted as somebody else to gain respectability? I don't think she saw this mindset really change in her entire lifetime. Because I myself have heard people spouting stuff like this. MS is a pure lotus rising from a slimy pond, a divine lily blooming in the dirty slush. No, not even the Bharat Ratna award could turn her into a Brahmin. Of those early years, Kunjama spoke but little. They were years of privation, deprivation, social disparagement, humiliation, and I think anxiety and fear. Shanmukhavadi was very eager to establish Kunjama, first on the stage, because it would increase her market value in finding a wealthy patron, hopefully of some royal lineage. Kunjama became conscious of the evils of her situation, and she knew that for her, the road to fame could also be the road to infamy. So, to her, gender exploitation was not a catchphrase, but a living, everyday reality. She was not ready to follow her mother or her sister in the Devadasi way of life, and this was Kunjama's world. Kunjama had inherited Sangeetam from her mother, music from her mother, and Bhakti, devotion, from her father. We can argue that in Carnatic music Sangeetam itself is Bhakti. Certainly, it is the foundation of the compositions of the three most celebrated composers of Carnatic music, Tyagaraja, Shama Shastri, and Muthuswami Dikshita. They were venerated as saints even in their own times. They did not make music for concerts and for performance, not for elite patrons in courts, not for a ticket-buying public. For them, faith became music, simple. They sang because they believed. They didn't compose, they prayed. Music was not art, music was self-surrender. This was something that she internalized, either by inborn impulse or evolving inclination, we don't know. But the self-surrendering quality, and the word self-surrender, which was two words in English that she knew very well, this was very, very important for her. And I think her pitch-perfect clarity in singing came from this self-surrendering devotion, this inward focus, and her sensitive modulation developed to reflect this conviction and the emotiveness that you find in her music.